I'm going to introduce everyone to, you never quite know whether you're supposed to be looking at the camera or the person, dear. I'm going to introduce everyone to my colleague and friend, Dr Elsie Walker, who is professor in the English department at Salisbury University in Maryland. You don't really teach any English, do you? You're pretty much 100% film. Yeah?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
Elsie is the author of Hearing Hanukkah, the soundtracks of Radical Auteur 2017, which is in our library, and the author of Understanding Soundtracks Through Film Theory 2015, which I haven't checked if it's in our library, and probably shouldn't have said that.
Scandalous.
So I invited Elsie to be a part of this session because I knew that she had been kind of blown away by this film, Killer Rashid, which we're going to watch today, and a lot of you will be watching, most of you probably watching for the first time. And it's maybe a bit of a first impressions film in a way that, you know, the first time you watch it will, it will either kind of fall into place or you might have some strong feelings about it. And so I wanted to start, just simply to start off, by asking you about the circumstances in which you first watched it and how it kind of related to what was going on with you at the time or anything else. You know, it's been an eventful year. We're doing this in 2020 in September. A very, very eventful year. So
I'll backtrack for a moment and say that I knew about the existence of this film for quite some time because some colleagues of mine told me about it. And they were very proud of the fact that they had seen it in its newly restored condition. You all may know that the film was made and then, in a sense, it's not available or it's effectively hidden for decades.
30 years.
Although it's had, an almost immediately unanimous positive critical response, it disappears. And then it's in danger of perishing through the deterioration of the film materials. So some archivists and film preservationists discover this problem and they restore the film, and then it's released to a much bigger audience than I think Charles Burnett ever imagined he would have. And then what happens from my point of view at a distance, I never read film reviews, never, ever, ever before I've seen a film. I only hear or pick up on word of mouth ideas sort of in the air before I hear or see a film, because I think it's so important that I come to the film fresh. So I want to be very careful not to presume too much about how your students will see, how you will. Let me address you students that I'm talking to. I don't want to presume to know how you will feel about this film. But I think it's very important you go into the film not feeling pressure to recognize that it's a landmark, because that very sort of pressure, I think, can get in the way of receiving the film on its own terms. And I had a number of very white and progressive, super woke, I don't know if you use that term in the UK at the moment,
it's
but there's almost,
people will know it, I think.
There's a competition to be the most progressive academic going on at virtually every American institution at the moment. And, you know, in that context, the story resonates because when Killer Sheep was re-released, a lot of people were proud not only of saying that they'd seen it, but in a way claiming the film through that. And there was something in me that resisted this. It almost was as if the film became canonized overnight. And whenever that happens, whenever I even get a whiff of something like the fetishization of the black person on screen, I have an aversion to it. And I also had the suspicion, and this will sound terrible, but I had the suspicion that it will be terribly hard work. And then I had other things to attend to that simply felt more pressing for a few years. But this year, it has felt more important than ever to look at the history of race on cinema and to directly engage with representations of African Americanness on film. And so I came to the film in the context of writing a chapter for a new book that I'm currently writing about the life of cinema. And the book is a kind of, without wanting to sound gauche, I'm very proud and excited about this project because I'm talking back to a book by Laura Mulvey called Death 24 Times a Second. And that book is a kind of landmark piece about the way whenever you're watching a film, you're watching presences that have already gone, lives that are already over, realities that have already ended, truths that have been processed before you came to them, and a production process that you can never get back to. So the thing itself always escapes your grasp. And in that sense, and she's thinking of celluloid cinema, which projects at the rate of 24 frames per second. So in that sense, for Mulvey, cinema is always about this death, at least implicitly. My argument is that cinema is life over and over and over again, because even when the presences on screen have long since passed, they relive through the bodies of the people watching them, seeing them and absorbing the sounds of those presences into their bodies. And this brings me to The Power of Killer of Sheep, which I watched in the context of studying black cinema and with particular focus on Spike Lee's much more mainstream film, BlacKkKlansman, which I was studying in particular. And it occurred to me that Lee is so self-aware about engaging with the cinema that precedes him, especially as BlacKkKlansman starts with some scenes from Gone with the Wind and Birth of a Nation. I now felt this new duty to look at more. And this is what led me to Killer of Sheep. So I sat down to watch Killer of Sheep with a pen in hand, ready to take notes dutifully, and, you know, to spend an afternoon ticking this off my list of requirements for the chapter. But as I'm watching the film, something happens to me where I can't just hold my chin thoughtfully, and I can't adopt this kind of affected distance from what I'm experiencing. And I realize that what's going on in front of me is so much bigger than a footnote for a chapter about another film. You know, that what I'm experiencing has a unique sort of logic and is taking up a space in my mind and in my heart that's much bigger than I had anticipated. And that's why it blew me away. And I should explain, moreover, that one of the main reasons why it affected me so much was not only did it feel new, but it uses sound in some extremely unusual and distinctive ways, ways that absolutely demand you be in a sort of constant contract with the film in terms of trying to understand what it's telling you. And that's because the visual and the sonic messages often don't line up. So that puts you necessarily in a very active position. And so, among other things, I feel like Killer of Sheep is presenting us with an extraordinary example of what the sound theorist Michel Chion calls added value. When Chion talks about added value, he's talking about how you have the images and the sounds, and you can potentially study the images, and then you can potentially study the sounds, and you can perhaps pick apart the film accordingly. But he talks about that extraordinary moment when you realize, or that incredible and undeniable interdependence that the visuals and the sounds will often have in a film, and that's where you have the concept of added value, which is essentially like saying the cumulative impact is much bigger than either one or the two combined. The sum of the whole is greater than the parts, is another way we would say that. But that sounds like a cliche, and this film is not a cliche. So that is how I came to the film, and now I just feel so grateful that I had to, that I was obliged. And among other things, I feel that this film has a lot to tell us as people trying to come to terms with the current Black Lives Matter movement and what it means, not only in America, but globally.
Yeah, it's I mean, I had a slightly similar process to watching it in that I knew its reputation. It might seem strange to the students that I've brought a film in that we're saying is kind of canonical, but the module started off looking at canons, and now we're trying to look at things that are marginalized. But I'll give you plenty of examples why this film has been marginalized in the session. Don't worry. I've got quotes here, 3 quotes that are going to be on the slides that speak to, Charles Burnett being well known for not being well known, and things like that. And you know, another quote by Michael Tolkien, the screenwriter, who says, "If Killer of Sheep were an Italian film from 1953, we would have every scene memorized," implying that because it's an African American made film from 1977, it wasn't on the map. So it's not, you know, it's in a strange position where it's both on the map and not, I suppose. But Charles Burnett, you know, coming to that thing about your process of watching Killer of Sheep, Charles Burnett's films are still not that easy to watch and get hold of.
Yes.
They have terrible distribution. This film had terrible distribution. One of the things that we'll talk about with the class, and that you will know, is one of the things that mitigated against the film's original full distribution was the expense with the rights to the famous music in it. But Charles Burnett wanted it in it, and I suppose the film started as his project for his master's thesis, and maybe it was not expected to kind of go into a kind of a real commercial space. I think the students, when they watch it, will agree that it doesn't feel like a film that's for a commercial space anyway.
Oh, absolutely. And maybe I'm sorry if I used the word canon in a misleading manner.
No. I think it is. I think it is kind of in a canon, but the canon that it's in is the sort of non-genre black cinema canon, which is a small canon. And certainly when Killer of Sheep finally came out, was very small.
But also, I think one of the problems with how it tends to be cited is almost like a sort of signifier of virtue. Oh, I've seen Killer of Sheep, you know, an academic will say, as if that were enough. And I didn't do a lot of research for this because I wanted to talk more out of these initial impressions I had and the kind of rawness of that, which I think is appropriate for this film. I don't think this film has prerequisites, and I think it's one of those experiences I think you want to go into as open-minded as possible. And, you know, when I started to read anything about it, I found myself becoming instantly irritated because what I was reading seemed separated from my own experience. And so what I want to urge your students, what I want to urge you all watching this video to do, is to go and not feeling like you have to perceive it a certain way. And I realize that anything I might say is totally contingent on my subject position. But backtracking for a moment, when we talk about the canon, you know, we do tend to talk about films that are more available and that have had a much longer run in terms of audience attention to them. And one thing I noticed almost immediately, just through a cursory glance at some scholarship on the film, and then, as I say, I became annoyed and had to put it aside. But one thing I became aware of almost immediately is that there's a cliche. There's often a cliche in the critical reception of a film. You know, if you look at a few reviews, you'll find that people pick up on the same nugget and then repeat it as if it becomes more true that way. So I realized that a cliche of the criticism of Killer of Sheep is that it's the American bicycle thieves. And I found this immediately annoying, so I think I should explain why. And I'm not sure if you all will have seen Bicycle Thieves.
Actually, this class will have seen probably quite a bit of Bicycle Thieves, maybe not the whole thing, but...
So you'll know the feel of it. And if you've seen extracts from Bicycle Thieves, then you'll realize that it's a very deceptively simple story following a father and a son trying to find the bicycle that was stolen from the father, and which he absolutely needs in order to have employment. And they are part of a family of 4 in a desperate situation, and they're representative of millions like them in the ruins of what was Mussolini's Italy. You know, they're a family among millions like them in desperate poverty and desperate need of employment, and desperately reliant on objects like bicycles just to make ends meet. So that's the ostensible subject of the film. But it's a very linear sort of narrative in terms of trying to locate this object. And yet by the end, without giving anything away, it becomes very clear to me that this is not a film about the bicycle at all. It's a film about what it means to live with this father and this son, and what it means to walk with them through these streets and in this feeling. And so in that sense, I think there are perhaps some parallels with Killer of Sheep, because the film wants you to become involved in an experience. And in a way, the narrative doesn't matter and becomes sort of irrelevant. But the shape of this film, it is, for me, radically different. Insofar as Bicycle Thieves was a linear narrative, there's the object and there's the pursuit of it. And the characters go from point A to B to C to D to try and locate it. But Killer of Sheep moves like a series of zigzags. And as you're watching it, you could be forgiven for completely losing your place in the puzzle of the film and not knowing who relates to who and who the names are. And I put to you, it doesn't matter, because this is not a film about any sort of clear-cut narrative. You dive into one scene in the middle of it, you dive into another, and it's about becoming one with that experience and not trying to package it too quickly. So that brings me to another irritation I experienced in this cursory survey of critical response to the film, which was that reviewers want to tell you that it's very edgy and raw, but also that there are moments of beauty and hope. Well, that makes it sound like any feel-good, tear-jerking, independent or international movie that's Oscar-worthy. I'm sure you know the kind of cliche I'm talking about. And I think this is quite wrong. It's quite, without wanting to anticipate too much again about how you'll respond to it, I think this is a real underestimation of what the film is willing to do and the places it's willing to take us. Because I don't think there's anything straightforwardly hopeful about it, except that it was made at all and that it's found an audience at all. I don't think there's anything in there that's saccharine or sentimental or packaged so that it can be palatable. I think it's made in a way that's deeply humanitarian, but it's also not pandering in any kind of way. And much as I love Bicycle Thieves, that film has an aesthetic contour that Killer of Sheep is not interested in. Bicycle Thieves was planned. It actually looks low budget, but it wasn't. Vittorio De Sica, the director, storyboarded virtually everything. It was extremely carefully scripted. No room for improvisation. And on top of that, it has this glorious score, this original score, this musical score by C. Cognini that underwrites everything that is of most emotional importance. But Killer of Sheep, by comparison with all that, is actually very low budget, and it uses the low budget reality to its advantage, because I think it leads to the filmmaker being much more lean in his approach, but in a way that matches how the characters have to live. And there are ways in which it feels as if he's quite deliberately not staging. And you could say the not staging is a sort of staging, but there are moments where you're looking at characters from behind them, for instance.
Yeah,
you're not seeing their faces,
Yeah, some edits and some angles and some edits, they're not there to portion the kind of scene up into easily digested kind of,
No, that's right. That's right.
And as you said about the order as well, you called it zigzag order. It's very episodic, but it's not like an episode with this bunch of characters and then an episode with this bunch of characters and then we return to the previous bunch of characters. There are some sets of characters or some moments that happen in it. It's very, very difficult to reconcile the pre-credits scene with anything later on, although I think Charles Burnett I won't spoil it for people, but I think Charles Burnett has offered some thoughts on it. But I totally agree with you on that. Its rhythm is not a kind of resolving rhythm. And the emotions aren't that resolving. I totally agree with you with that as well. Can I ask you something about the characters then? So that the students have got something to return to. I'll ask about the music as well in a minute, but the sort of central family is Stan's family, and you've got Stan and his I think unnamed wife. I couldn't find a name for the wife character, who actually takes a lot of dramatic emphasis in the film and is, I'd say, something maybe close to an an identificatory figure, because I think Stan is quite difficult to identify with for deliberate reasons to do with how the film is made. So, you know, you said earlier the film isn't interested in doing that bicycle thieves kind of walk with this man through the harshness of his life. I think, you know, you're not really with Stan in the same way as you're forced to be with Ricci in Bicycle Thieves. So his wife is a very sympathetic figure, I think. I think the film knows that and is playing with that. But one thing I notice about it is how separate the adults' lives and the adults' world is in the film from the children's. So you've kind of got a kid's world which operates one way with one logic, and then you've got the adults' world. And they do cross over, and there are scenes where, particularly where Stan and his little girl are together, and there's a beautiful scene where the little girl sings an Earth, Wind and Fire song, which is playing on the record player, and her mum watches her with a lot of fondness. But apart from those moments, the kids live this really quite separate world, and I wonder what you think about that. You know, I find the kids' world in the film quite harsh and kind of like hostile, and I find the adults' world not as hostile. Like, people aren't fighting as much, but they're a bit maybe resigned. You know, resignation is a word that comes up when I watch the film a lot, because there's a very distinctive energy to it, which is almost a lack of energy as well, which makes it anti-Hollywood as well, and anti-narrative. So what do you make of the kind of the kids and the adults and their spaces in the film?
Well, first of all, going back to what you're saying about the mother figure, Stan's wife, I share your sense of connection to her. I can't identify with her in the usual way because she's often shot at a distance, so I don't feel visually fused with her. Yeah. But the film does something for her that I don't think it does for the other characters, and that is it gives her a kind of internal life through what she can't say on screen and what you hear her nevertheless say. So there's a moment where she just sits down with this kind of gesture of defeat, going back to what you were just pointing out, because she's just been dancing with Stan. And, I mean, it's one of the most extraordinary in-the-body experiences I've had watching that. I mean, I can feel her sadness and her need for him.
Fantastically.
It's an astonishing, and it doesn't feel like a performance. No. It feels like agony, registered in the subtlest of movements and changes in her face. And I think one of the reasons why it's so amplified is that you've got Dinah Washington's marvelous performance of This Bitter Earth, which I knew first from Shutter Island, weirdly. So that was one of those moments where I read the body of the woman and the sadness imported almost retrospectively back from Shutter Island. But then that's something like this, there's this rich, mellow, painful but gorgeous voice telling you what she feels. And then after he leaves and she's in this kind of shock, you hear this voiceover, and it's a very weird disembodied part of the film, because I find myself thinking, is this her voice or is this someone else's voice? And it reminded me of, I think, a general principle in the whole film, which is that sometimes you hear a voice and it doesn't matter in a way whether it's literally the character's voice. It's saying something that they need to say. And there are other moments where characters speak for themselves much more clearly. I mean, there's one character, there's a man who gets very frustrated when the car breaks down, and he literally says, "I'm singing the blues." I remember that because it's unusual for a character to talk about themselves in this way, especially when there's blues music in the film as well. But it occurs to me she can't say that much. But in her body and in her silences and in the way she looks at her daughter, who's able to touch her father and sort of massage his shoulders and make him smile in the way that her mother wishes she could. In those moments where you have music or silence, I think the film is inviting you to be very connected to her. And I think that's where some of the ultimate compassion of the film lies, but not in a sentimental way. Yeah. And in a way that again requires your active participation in it. So that's part of what makes it a very unusual film, and a film that doesn't abide by mainstream logic, because it requires that level of imaginative engagement. Which is not to say that mainstream films don't require meta engagement, but they just require it differently, not necessarily in terms of understanding what the internal psychological complexities of a character's life might be. Those seem to be, I think, more readable, or we're used to them being more readable, more apparent to us, as they are in Shutter Island, where you get the same music.
Yeah.
And then going back to what you were saying about, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but I was going to address what you said about children and adults.
Yeah. That's okay.
Because I actually had a different read from you, but remember, I'm coming at this new, and I probably don't know the film as well as you do, but I was really struck, and I pulled up my notes here, by the opening, which for me fuses the world of adults and children in a really uncomfortable way. So I just wanted to take us back to that moment. The way the film begins is you hear children singing a lullaby, and it sounds very childish. La 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 bye bye. Do you want the stars to play with? And then there's this very tight close-up. It's so tight you don't even see the whole boy's face. And then you realize that his father is there, and he's threatening to kill his son for fighting with his brother.
It's for not defending his brother.
Or not defending his brother. Okay. Yeah. So he's disappointed. He's profound to the extent that he's threatening to beat his son to death. And then the father says to him, "You're not a child anymore." But he is a child. So immediately I'm thinking, why would you talk to a child this way as if he's not a child? He is a child. He's visually present to us as that. And then the mother enters the scene, I think, shortly after, and she slaps the boy hard.
Which is almost worse than the treatment from the father, because the father's treatment you can take on some kind of metaphorical level, but the punishment is verbal from the father, and it sounds terrible, but it's kind of it's language. And then his mum doesn't say anything and slaps him. It's worse,
I mean, either way, it's horrible. But yeah, I think the fact that they seem in agreement on this matter, is devastating.
I mean, it's a violent.
It's
a violent world in the film, I think.
Yeah.
And that sets it off. That kind of sets the tone off. But I suppose my point about the worlds of the adults and the world of the kids being different is that there is violence in the male adult world in the film. So you see very early on, you see two kind of guys in their 20s stealing a TV from a house.
Yeah.
And an older, kind of more, conventional neighbour watches them and goes off to call the police, and so one of the thieves wants to go and kick his ass, basically. And so you get this threat of violence, but actually the way that men, it's generally men, but there are a number of interesting female characters as well, particularly Stan's wife. The way they engage with each other is not, it doesn't feel like that threat is going to spill over into violence. There is one kick aimed by a woman at a man who's lying on the ground, but it's not played for great emphasis by the film. Whereas the kids are always in these kind of wars. The kids are always having these war games. So you see two separate incidents of kids being beaten up by other kids, and you can't always tell if it's going out of the play acting realm into the really hurting realm.
Well, I think you make a great point there, because even though I think for me the world of adults and children is sort of uncomfortably mixed up, and even in that opening scene you hear the children singing that lullaby, but then it's picked up by Paul Robeson, the same song, and so for me it's almost like child's body and adult's body become one in a strange way. But I also recognize that the child's voice is very different, and that the collective children's voice is very different from the solo, deep man's voice that has the weight of experience behind it. So, I'd put to you then that children and adults alike are all dealing with these extremities of poverty and desperation and limited means and limited entertainment and being at the mercy of what happens to them. To a large degree, and yet the means for handling these situations is very different. So the male adult is at work where he commits violence against animals, not people, and that's his job. And I think that's where a lot of the violent energy of the film goes. And I think you're meant.
Point there. Can I bring up music again, because you've made me think. I didn't know this song, this piece of music at all until I watched the film, and then I looked it up, and then I listened to the music separately from the film on YouTube, and it's the Afro-American Symphony by.
Oh my goodness! Yeah.
Still. Now that plays.
Yeah.
Over one of the abattoir scenes.
Yes.
Now, I was trying to think of how I would describe my limited musicological, set of terms. I was thinking how I would describe it. And what's weird about the match between Afro-American Symphony and the abattoir scene is, to me, although it's kind of, quite obviously rich and classical, it's kind of playful sounding.
Yeah.
There's
an incredible piece. And one of the things I really love about this film is it surprises me over and over again through the musical choices. There's so much range there. And, I'm really hoping that more people will pay attention to that. Because people, I think, could easily identify the Dinah Washington. But you're talking about a symphonic work that represents a different kind of African-American voice that might not be so well known. But listening to that music, you're absolutely right. I think there is something very playful about it, and there's something very American about it too.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I should probably explain what I mean by that. And I think you don't have to be a musicologist to appreciate that there's a strangeness about the combination of the slaughterhouse with this music, and it's not like in a Kubrick film or a Scorsese film where sometimes there's classical music. And it gives a sort of grace and elegance to what would otherwise not read that way. Yeah. If anything, I think the music absolutely insists on retaining its own logic, and you're held in that experience of dissonance, you could say. Or what Sound Scholars often use is the term counterpoint, to talk about how the music doesn't match the visual. And there's this sense of competing logic that has meaning within it. So in terms of that music, that specific piece, it sounds a little bit to me like the works of Aaron Copland, who's probably the most famous American symphonic composer. But it also seems, and he's famous for having very open sounds and using pitches, if you're listening to pitches that spread across wide ranges, and orchestrations that use a lot of different colors. So there's a sort of exuberance and a kind of evocation of the open range or the Wild West frontier in Cohen's music. And I think you can hear that, but then it's also, I think, influenced by elements of blues and jazz. Mm. And that has to do with the way it incorporates a lot of semitones and what sounds like almost improvisatory sections, even though they're not, as far as I can tell. So what you've got is a kind of quintessential experience of American music fused with African American experience, and then you've got that beauty and that kind of cultural richness combined with the awfulness of seeing these animals, very deliberately destroyed for consumption, and you can be sure that the people who are eating those animals are not the people you're primarily following, because they won't be able to afford this meat.
Yeah, that's a good point. And by the way, the film makes it clear that Stan doesn't derive any pleasure from that job. I mean, if it needs saying, he actually says at one point, "I've got to get maybe twice, I've got to get a new job." You know, it's not like I'm conscious I'm going to move on in a sec because I'm conscious the Zoom might run out. But it's not like the playfulness or the sort of joy in the still symphony is meant to be kind of giving you some sort of insight into how Stan is feeling at that moment. It's something external to Stan.
Yes.
Stan finds the job deadening, and that's why he's so resigned, and that's why he's rather deadened to his wife's sort of emotional needs and so on, I think.
Absolutely.
Or maybe even to his own physical and emotional.
Yes. Yeah, now, he seems dissociated. Yes, go ahead.
I'm worried the Zoom will kick us out and put us on 40 minutes long. I mean, that's brilliant. Thank you. I obviously want to talk about the music with you, and I want the students to really listen to the various Paul Robeson songs. The House I Live In, which is it has been sung by a lot of famous white singers, I think, as well. So it's not as if it I think Sinatra sang it, so it's not as if it belongs to Paul Robeson. I'll say to you students who Paul Robeson was if you don't know. I think Pete might have covered this already in another module, but I'll get to that. And I hope people really listen to the lyrics. I'll check them out later. But before we finish, and in case Zoom brings the curtain down, I want to ask you a little bit what it's been like since sort of April, May in the States, living and working with young people. You got young people in your house as well, but I mean, working as I work with young people, working with the same age group of people, while Black Lives Matter as a discourse and as a massive shock and sense of outrage has been going on. I don't expect you to represent the movement in a way. I'd just like to get your take on what it's been like in universities. How has it been with working with people? How are the students reacting to it? Are they seeing it in terms of film or anything in particular?
I mean, the temperature's very hot right now, and I feel more than ever that we want to use cinema to help us handle and work through and hopefully grow stronger through the present moment. And I feel that Killer of Sheep, among many other films that feature African-American actors, deserves more attention, because even though it's widely celebrated, as you say, it's not widely available enough.
Yeah.
And there's also so much more to say about it. And so as a practitioner, I'm thinking a lot more about teaching films that feature African-American actors and other persons of color. And I'm also thinking about what's at stake in hearing the people of these films better. And so that means, in the case of Killer of Sheep, listening to all the different African-American voices that are in it, to hearing how the film asks you to listen. I mean, there's often a lot of quiet around the voices, which for me is a very important maneuver on the film's part. It's got a very pared down soundtrack, so it's usually either voices or music, and then occasionally, as I remember, traffic. So you never are meant to forget the world beyond the characters that surround the characters, but also a world that's more mobile than the world of your primary characters tends to be. And just coming back, I realized, just in the interest of time, to that Robeson song, when he's talking about what America is, that stopped me in my tracks in terms of the current moment, because over here, I think a lot of people are asking what defines America. They're asking it in a different way, because we all want to believe in this ideal that America is an all-embracing, truly open-minded place of liberty and democracy where all races meet.
Yeah, the mythic America, almost like the
right.
Not the mythic kind of Western type America, but the mythic kind of positive sort of democratic America.
Yeah, everyone wants to believe that. And I was watching. I don't know if you've seen Queen and Slim, but I bet some students watching this will have. And oh my goodness, get right on it. And I don't say that lightly, because I don't much like it when people tell me you have to see this, but you have to see this film, because it came out last year, but it may as well have been made 5 minutes ago in terms of what it has to say about the current Black Lives Matter movement. And it's also it's a potent reminder that what Burnett was exploring in terms of a divided America is still something that we have to address. And it reminds us, too, that focusing almost entirely on Black characters is still unusual. And yet, if we don't start listening to Black voices better, then I don't think we're going to address the deep-seated infrastructural, institutionalized, and historical racism that has been the given in this country. And, I know plenty of African-American colleagues who are suffering greatly, but it's not for lack of loving America. And I think that's essentially what the song is about. Robeson was a civil rights activist, and there's a kind of pain, I think, in that song, but it's also about declaring a level of attachment.
Yeah.
And so even though, the current Black Lives Matter movement has been deeply distressing in terms of what it's forcing people to confront, I also think it's ultimately very hope-giving, and I have personally felt energized by participating in marches. I live in a small town I mean, it's not exactly podunk, middle of nowhere, but pretty close to it. 2 hours away from all the major cities, DC, Philadelphia, a little further from New York City. And, there are fewer than 100,000 people here when the city is maxed out. But I went on a Black Lives Matter march that had thousands of people from my local community, thousands of people, even though we're a college town and the students were away this summer, walking through the streets. And the local police and the hospital and the university were all involved in this. It was covered widely. The mayor was there, or the interim mayor was there. I mean, it was this huge event that sort of folded everyone into it.
Yeah.
And I think that's where the hope lies. We've needed huge change for a long time, but I think ever since the tragedy of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor in particular, I think there's a different level of national consciousness about that need. And I think people are listening differently. So in a place like Salt Lake City, where I think it's something like a 2% white population, you've still got huge turnouts for Black Lives Matter marches. And I think that points to a very real sea change that connects and reverberates with films like Killer of Sheep that have always known that we had to do better.
Yeah, there's a lot of work. Thank you for putting it in such a sort of a nicely summarised way. There's a lot of work to be done, and even if Killer of Sheep has been held up for quite a long time as this important film, landmark, as you say, you're quite right. It actually isn't seen by that many people still. And the revival it had in 2007, I think it was 2007, it was over pretty quickly, and it's still not kind of, I kind of worried a little bit about introducing it to this module, that maybe it was that bit too much of a canonical thing. But actually, I look at other syllabi of American cinema modules and contemporary cinema modules, or realism and cinema modules, and even African American cinema portions of Hollywood modules. And actually, it isn't covered that often. So it isn't that widely seen. And we're lucky it was televised a few years ago, which is why it's on Lots of Broadcast, which is the platform we use to screen it. Mm-hmm. I'm really conscious that Zoom might cut us out, and then I'm going to look so stupid for not having summarised and finished on a proper note. But I'm going to finish there and thank you. We know what a turbulent year it's been, and from over here it's been quite evident. A lot of the students will have been involved in things over here too, related to BLM. And maybe next year, if I use when I use this film again in relation to Killer of Sheep, this recording we're doing, maybe we will still need the Black Lives Matter section, but things will be different. Of course, we don't know that they'll be different for the better, which is why there's a lot of work still to do, isn't there? Meanwhile, thank you for taking the time to come and speak to my students and talk to us and share your thoughts about Killer of Sheep, particularly about the music. I could listen to you talk about the music a lot. So yeah, if you have any additional ideas about the music, please put them in the chat, send them to me in an email, anything that means lecture. Because, as I said, I didn't even know the Afro-American Symphony before watching this film. But thanks very much, Elsie. I'm going to finish recording now.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much.
I'm so glad.
Thank you from everyone.
Thank you.